Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and this is probably a great opportunity to segue into our deeper dive into COVID-19 as well. So from your perspective, Cynthia, what do you think made COVID-19 a polycrisis? And you can let me know if I'm getting too far ahead too.
Oh, no, I don't think so. And I want to know yours too, right? Because I
Of
think it's
course.
really important that um I think it's really important that we kind of, you know, put all this together, through different perspectives. I think you've already touched on a lot of those, was key ones, right? Um, and I think that this is where I'm going to get in trouble because
Oh,
I'm going to geek out on this a little bit, and I can say, yeah, it's because of this virus that hopped over, and then we didn't have sufficient warning. We didn't listen to Taiwan, or we didn't. We can point to those kinds of issues, right? But that are very tangible. But again, I'm going to go right back to our respective blind spots, right? Where I think that we can say, well, here are the tangible scientific and sociological and and political causes behind this but it's also looking at what we can't see and what we
mhm.
don't see. And despite all the warnings that we've had that there was going to be a catastrophic respiratory epidemic and that were in place, not enough of our policymakers paid attention.
Mhm.
Right. So it really resided in, this kind of, these little bubbles of expertise, and Bill Gates, to be fair, trying to take it out of that bubble and warn us. So I would say that, yeah, there are the immediate causes, right? Of, this is A to B to C to maybe, D, E, F, G, and so forth in terms of the chain. And now we're kind of touching on say like a futures wheel, right? Or some kind of linchpin analysis, right? Which
Right.
is kind of branching out, right? um but I really like to derive lessons from these things, and not just necessarily lessons for humanity. That's We don't have control over that. From a practitioner perspective, I like to think about, well, as practitioners, how can we understand this better to protect our own organizations and various interests and so forth, right? So I'm looking at this as, well, paying attention to the blind spots. Right? So what were we not seeing that we could have seen? And this goes back to what you were saying about stakeholders too, right?
Yeah.
Because, as perhaps maybe we're in the front lines of picking up these signals in our organizations and bringing it back. Now we've got to convince the various stakeholders of this. And this happens also not just within our own organizations, for most of us here in this audience, corporations, um, government, nonprofit, right?
Yeah.
Military, like any institution this applies to. So I'm sorry to not be as concrete. I was being a little bit more meta. But I think that that's really an important point, because there's so much that have been said about, well, it's because of this hopping over to the wet market, or maybe some people are saying, well, it's also the lab, right?
Lab
Whatever
origin.
it
Yep.
is.
Yep.
Yeah. But I think that beneath all that is just that we have not built the proper infrastructure to help us see better.
Mhm.
Seeing around those corners, right? Seeing in between, seeing the white spaces, et cetera, and and now we can't necessarily expect that from government. Politically, I think that makes it very difficult. But for us, in the domains that we do have control over, our various organizations, we can be more resilient. We can be more anti-fragile. We can be more proactive.
Mhm.
So I think that that's where I prefer to focus, I think. But I will also say, to recognize that looking at the COVID from the standpoint of, say, creating a futures wheel and looking at the various causes of, effects, right, of, in different branches and domains, and how the reactions, first tier, second tier, third tier reactions are, that's also really fun.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
we want to go down that direction. We can certainly do that. I think it's probably better supported by a diagram, but there are also a lot of really great diagrams out there. So, people who are out here just want to see that, you can just type in, COVID and futures wheel, and you'll see some really cool examples. But I think that importantly, though, we also have to understand not just what we know, what we've been talking about, but what we haven't seen to the unseen, because
Mhm.
I think that was probably as much, if not more of the problem, because those created the real barriers to our stemming the pandemic. We
Mhm.
could have.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I really appreciated every piece of that. And there's so much material to chew on in there, and I, from my perspective, so you asked for what my perspective on the COVID-19 pandemic was. And to me, it definitely falls into the gray rhino category, or some aspects of it certainly did. The premise of a global respiratory pandemic, having lived through the first SARS epidemic and having seen what that was, and so much milder by comparison, but still, in its time and in its context, really quite impactful on global travel and economic activity in a way that you could say, oh, okay, this, early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, that gave me sort of a template of what I thought or expected would happen. And then sort of the interplay of, let's say, a social movement that has been bubbling along for a long time now for anti-vaccine preferences, and the sort of skepticism of established pharmaceutical or medical advice that's out there, at the time, was certainly in the water. And and as we've replaced the fluoride in our water with skepticism now. So having looked at that, and for quite some time, going all the way back, probably going further back than this point, but going back to at least the articles, since sort of withdrawn from the Lancet, about vaccines causing autism and those sorts of things. So recognizing that social movement of, hey, we're not so sure established life sciences are really here to help us, or whether it's intentional or not, are actually causing harm. So that skepticism, so that combination of a 1-2, always, for me, made COVID a black rhino, a gray rhino in its way, but also still as gray rhino as it was, sort of so much more significant than I had expected it to be. And so, thinking about applying that SARS framework of thinking onto COVID-19, and in a lot of ways failing to anticipate a lot of the implications for something that could be much more severe or significant. So, while I categorize it or taxonomize it as a gray rhino, and ultimately I do agree with you, it doesn't really matter, except insofar as recognizing what is your communication strategy, or what is the decision framing strategy that goes around this. Anyway, so
And
that's
signals
my take on
gathering.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, and signals gathering. Yeah, and I really love it, because I think you've touched on some of the really important branches, um, sort of causal branches, that really help to create that perfect storm,
Mhm.
right? And then I think that from the standpoint of polycrisis, it's also really important for us to think about the various types of global infrastructures that were there and weren't there,
Mhm.
right? Because that also contributed to it, because whether or not there was a sufficient global early warning system. I already mentioned that Taiwan was already, because the SARS, you mentioned, so very eloquently, that SARS was already very familiar to them. So they wisely had already been monitoring, these
Mhm.
these these viruses, and they've been doing that. And when they started to notice this, and they were getting some intel from China saying something strange is going on, and even some Chinese doctors were pinging and saying, "Okay, we've got a problem here," and that not enough of the global institutions were picking up on this early enough. Politics got in the way, right? Because hey,
Yeah.
do we recognize Taiwan? Okay, well, they just said something, but I can't hear you because we don't recognize Taiwan.
Because we don't recognize you. Yeah, exactly.
There's a little bit of that too. And and then there's also the element of just, it's very hard for us to recognize something that we don't have experience with.
Mhm.
And because we are so Western dominant in many ways, we weren't really paying attention to the experiences of countries in the East who had been going through this, right? So that
Right.
was another blind spot of ours. So I think that on an institutional basis, it's very macro. that also was a contributing factor to this, because
Hmm.
we really didn't have a very good system, right,
Hmm.
to be able to pick up on the signals, to warn, and then to coordinate.
Hmm.
So I think when we're talking about polycrisis, it's not just about what happens, it's also about what is in place to be able to address emergent,
Yes.
right, tendrils,
Yes.
if you will. And and then of course, just I think from a social perspective, social psychological perspective, I think once this thing really got out of control, I think people certainly became more panicked, and so now you have sort of more rationality built up on this, right? And we weren't prepared for that either, because many of
Right.
us haven't really lived through some kind of social crisis in the
Hmm.
same way. And of course then it was exploited politically,
Yes.
right? That was another tendril. So now we're starting, and we don't have enough time to get into all of the different facets or tendrils of this, but I hope that where we're at right now in the conversation helps to illustrate that there are a lot of branches and causal effects, and what we just discussed in part one, where it reinforces one another, it amplifies one another,
Hmm.
maybe even it kind of creates a third head,
Yeah.
right? Because it's like a hydra, right?
Right.
And so I think that that's an important recognition for those of us who are trying to learn from this and trying to address various aspects of polycrisis, right? Is to understand that these types of branches can also have unintended consequences if we're not really careful about the way that we frame
Hmm.
and approach these issues that are multidimensional. And again, that psychological aspect is huge from the standpoint of the stakeholders, right? For sure. People who are decision makers who may or may not be on board. And then you also have the general public, right? And then people in between, right? Like
Hmm.
lawmakers and so on and so forth. And so that's where it's really important that people don't dive into matters of polycrisis with very simple tools like that hammer, right? And everything's a nail.
Everything's a nail.
Um, that we approach polycrisis analysis and solutions building um, with nuance, with care, and iteratively, and with ongoing discussions with a cross section of experts who are also talking to one another.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in some ways, it's really amazing some of the ways that we did come through
Mm.
this particular polycrisis, because in the beginning there were just so many mistakes, one after another, and we can talk about the political motivations, whether that's of leaders in the U.S. and the West, or whether that's of leaders in China that may have had motivations to actually cut off some of the signals that the world would have benefited from, for the sake of protecting their political well-being within their national political context. And then to think about some of the early missteps of the WHO. And I think that's really something I'd like to double click on as well here, because that speaks to, I think, some of the psychological factors that were at play there, because people were very hungry for a level of certainty. And I think some experts in a particular domain maybe got in front of their skis in terms of what they were communicating, particularly early on, because just one quintessential example here is the absolute whipsaw that occurred about communication about the efficacy or the benefit of wearing masks, where the original communication was do not wear masks. And in retrospect, you're kind of like, well, how did we get there? And at the time, people just didn't recognize, and then you're talking to this public set of stakeholders, the general public, that sometime, and particularly in a moment of crisis, is just so focused on certainty. So when the WHO and other, CDC and other organizations did a 180 on masks, well, that fed into that zeitgeist that I talked about before with respect to anti-vaxxer perspective and that sort of thing. And you can see very rational people saying, well, how can I believe you at all in the context of this? So, just talking about the psychology of all of this.
Absolutely. I love this because I think that one of the things that we need to pay attention to here, right, is that, well, I'll just back up by saying a lot of people lost confidence, right,
Mhm.
in some of our, most brilliant scientists and epidemiologists, certainly key among them, um, because information was moving so rapidly. And I
Mhm.
think that this was really more of a, so COVID is more of an urgent polycrisis, right? Because it was rapidly moving. Because that's going back to the fact that not all of polycrisis, were breathless and moving at that pace. So as we're moving very rapidly and just trying to understand something novel, right? It's novel coronavirus. Um, it, when we're facing something novel, unfortunately, our very primitive brains are still trying to index it to things we understand and know.
Mhm.
And so for us, and even scientists, right, to say, okay, well, typically, how do we handle these things? And in the face of a lot of information. And so we may oversimplify, but at the same time, recognizing too that with the scientific process, it's iterative, right? We're
Mhm.
trying to find new information. So yeah, initially we might index on what seems familiar, what we understand, what's the best explanation, Occam's razor, right? Could be, because that's where our brains want to go very often too. We also, we need to understand that all of this is just iterative. We need to be patient through this, right? Even if there's a sense of urgency, is to understand, okay, this is why we have tools and frames to make sure that we don't get in our own way. Well, I should probably
Yeah.
come back here, right? We don't get in our own way,
Yeah.
cognitively and even socially and so forth. And that's why, you and I, in the work that we've done too, is to try to look at decision making itself, and to understand that it's way more than just tools. Too often we think about it as, well, this is how we judge things, or just, these are the various tools that we use. And in the work, that we've been doing through the collaborative, is to help people understand that there are many more facets, and we'll go into this in another discussion when we talk about foundations. But there are many more facets, to understanding decision making, to support decision making, than just good facts and good frameworks, right, and models, which is unfortunately where we tend to pay most of our attention. Anyway, so to say that it's really important for us to understand that, that our own ability to understand, and our own primitive reactions, also played into this as well. And then, as the I also want to touch on the fact that, as COVID was starting to emerge into the pandemic and a crisis, it becomes compounded by all of these elements too. I think that anybody who's approaching polycrisis as an issue, right, a collective of issues, need to understand that it's not even just understanding the branching or kind of the hydra aspects of this, but to understand that many, very, very often, the reactions to the early issues, or to the early problems, sometimes can have a compounding effect. And then the further we go out into kind of the circle of effects, we get even more compounding, because it gets more complex. There are, I think, a greater variety of reactions,
Mhm.
and and reactions that can also spin off unintended consequences. And again, that's kind of the futures will certainly does a good job of that, but also any kind of many types of branching analytical models do that too. It's really important to understand that compounding aspect of it too,
Mhm.
and um, how that in itself can become a problem, not just the problem that we're studying.